Hello, everyone, and welcome to our podcast for our Louisa May Alcott class. I am Lindsay Danielson, and I am joined by
Sarah Danielson.
And we are sisters, hence why our voices probably sound pretty similar. So
for the viewers at home, we sound very similar. Everyone always tells us we sound exactly the same. So maybe a podcast wasn't the greatest.
but we're doing it, so.
Also, we're wearing masks, so my voice usually doesn't sound like a blanket is shoved over it.
Okay, and so we're going to be looking at the article called Chasing Amy, Mephistopheles, the Laurence Boy, and Louisa May Alcott's Punishment of Female Ambition. That is by Holly Blackford. I looked it up. I believe she's a PhD at Rutgers, maybe, and got her her degree at UC Berkeley, I believe. So,
Holly, if you're listening, you're a great writer.
Yes. So the question we kind of came in wondering about was basically, who is Amy?
It's a pretty broad question.
It is a broad question, but I was just telling Sarah, I feel like the more I've interacted with this text and the films that have been inspired by it over the years, I've been more and more confused about Amy's character rather than had her clarified for me, basically. And so that was what I was looking at, and we also want to ask, especially in her relationship with Joe, because we feel that that is a very important relationship in the text.
Yeah.
And a lot of the, moments of conflict, I guess you could say, rather than, sisterly love, kind of take place between those two.
Yeah, in a novel that's centered around, happiness in the domestic sphere, I think their relationship definitely adds a tension that isn't previously seen.
And I remember when I was a kid watching Gillian Armstrong's film,
Is that the Winona Ryder one?
The Winona Ryder version. The main moments that stuck out to me were, Amy burning the manuscript and, obviously I feel like the relationship between, when Amy gets with Laurie at the end is a little more, awkward in the tone that it has than Greta Gerwig's version, for example.
Yeah, even the reception of Amy, I feel like the reception of Amy over the years has largely been negative, and we're starting to face a culture shift in viewing her.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that reception wouldn't have happened unless there were elements of her in this story that were seen kind of as an antagonist to Joe.
Yeah, that's a good point. So yes. Sarah, do you want to start us off maybe by talking a little bit about what you got out of the article, or any questions it raised for you, or yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So with this Chasing Amy article, it kind of had an ominous tone. I don't know. She was viewing Amy directly in relation to Alcott's more sensationalist, scary thrillers. Mm-hmm. So I was just kind of spooked. Had to read it with the lights on.
Yeah, so the thesis, I guess you could say, of Blackford's article is kind of that Amy stands for all that Alcott didn't kind of like about art, aka the pursuit of art, say, just for fame's sake, or the pursuit of genius solely behind art. And I think that Blackford, let me find the quote. Amy is a cheapened artist who failed to cultivate genius, and so eventually she got transformed into the object of art, and that she kind of just transforms herself into a piece of artwork, kind of because her art is inherently narcissistic. Blackford points to the scene where Amy makes a cast of her foot for an example in this. But also, in terms of what you're saying with the spookiness, I kind of got that too, like, just a lot of demonic language, because like I said when I said the title first, Blackford is looking at Little Women in relation to Alcott's other works, and the character of Mephistopheles, who is kind of this demon-like character that chases after women and, like, just stands for badness in art. So that was something I noticed about the article, was that I didn't feel that the word demonic was particularly helpful, just because I thought it was applied pretty liberally. There was another quote where Blackford says that Jo expels the demonic in Mr. Laurence, like, when she kind of, like
Laurie's grandfather?
Yeah, when Mr. Laurence and Laurie are having that argument, and then, like, Jo has to, like, talk Mr. Laurence down, and I was like, okay, if you're using the word demonic in this context, I don't really see how you could be using it in other contexts in this piece to talk about art, because that had nothing really to do with art.
Or even how she talked about, like, Amy. She portrayed Amy as both demonic and an innocent person who demons were going after.
Right.
Like, at the beginning, she was talking about Amy sort of as Jo's inner demon. Like, when Jo has this kind of tendency to search after art in this more sensationalized way, relying more on the product than the act of creation itself. So she said, like, when Amy burns that, when Amy burns Jo's stories, Amy is, like, pushing Jo towards her inner demons, and that's, like, why it's called Apollyon, because that's a demon in Pilgrim's Progress. So in that setting and in that description, Amy is, like, seen as inherently evil and, like, an antagonist, again, to Jo's writing process. But then later on in this story, or in her essay, she seems to take a more innocent approach regarding Amy, saying that Laurie's almost the demonic influence over Amy. So it just kind of leaves me in limbo, like, who is Amy in this story?
And, like, what is the definition of the demonic to Blackford? Because I also noticed that, like, that she really characterized Laurie in a very negative way. Yes, readers who haven't read this article, I'll try to explain a little bit very quickly, but she really leans into the negative aspects of Laurie, and, like, how, for example, when Jo rejects him, he says, "I'm gonna go to the devil," and when in Castles in the Air, when when they're talking about getting to the heavenly gates, and Laurie's like, "Make sure to put in a good word for me, Beth," and stuff like that, and just how his indolence, like, leads him to that path of the demonic, as Blackford would call it. And she even says that he preys upon Amy and stuff like that. And so I didn't really agree with that characterization. I think that was a pretty weak point in her article, just because I feel like Amy's character arc, her marriage with Laurie, is kind of the end of the character arc, or, like, one of the last things to happen to her character. And so I think one of the big things about that marriage is that she decided to marry him out of love. If she had probably would have been worse for her if she had actually gone through with marrying Fred Vaughn. And that
so if anything, that would have led her more to performance.
Exactly. And that, she would have just leaned even more into that, like, social performance object role, if she had married Fred Vaughn. So I didn't really buy the Laurie as evil bent.
What did you think about, in her article, Blackford really seemed to say that Amy was almost in no position to make that decision regarding her life, since she was in a place of vulnerability because she was, like, separated from her family. Like, Blackford, going along the lines of, like, Laurie as the demonic, she, in the praying she was talking about of Laurie on the March Sisters
Yeah.
in general, she mentioned him, like, looking out his window, knowing things about them before they've told him.
The Byronic hero thing.
Yeah, so in that, he is demonic, so she's basically, to me it seemed that she was saying, now that Amy was suddenly separated from the safety of the March home, that's when he makes his appearance to her, when she's in exile. And I didn't really buy that in that case. I almost feel like Laurie was not demonic, but just like this lonely boy who was enveloped into the family fold.
Mm-hmm.
So when he and Amy were together in Europe, it was them trying to, like, jointly move through the death and, like, grief of this person they both love and lost, instead of him seeing his opportunity to strike.
Right.
But again, I guess that just is based on how you characterize Laurie, but I think she focuses a lot on minute details regarding his characterization while missing the obviously positive and angelic aspects that Alcott also gives him.
Yes, I agree. And that kind of moves me into another point that I wanted to talk about, which is just, like, the twofold nature of Amy as well. And I think this is where a lot of my, like, confusion, I guess you could call it, about Amy's character comes from. Blackford says that you have kind of the innocent baby Amy, but then when she's older, like in part 2, and when she goes off to Europe, you have this elusive European lady who promotes herself as her own central artistic project. And so I kind of think that Amy's whole thing is being, like, two-sided in some ways. Yeah. I have a passage in the text that I wanted to turn to for that. This takes place in Lazy Laurence, which is the chapter where Amy and Laurie are conversing in, like, the very idyllic setting. Yes, and they're, like, looking at roses, and Amy says, "Did you ever see such roses?" And then Laurie says, "No, nor felt such thorns." And I thought that was kind of a call to Amy's character, in that there's that part of her that's, like, sweet and just kind, but then there's that part of her that's, like, the ice lady, kind of thorny. And Blackford also mentions this and says, the narrator seems to be puzzled. Was Amy always this mature person, or was polish layered on a rougher diamond? And, like, that the narrator attempts to articulate Amy's depth even while maintaining that what others see are silk, title, and sophistication. So I
guess I'm confused, because literally that's how all people are.
I was thinking the same thing,
And what does that say for Joe? Like, Joe's just born into adulthood? I don't get it. It reminds me of this Maya Angelou quote. Actually, it's by me right now. Where she's talking about, like, people don't actually grow up. They just, like, let me see it. I am convinced that most people do not grow up. We find parking spaces and honor our credit cards. We marry and dare to have children and call that growing up. And then she says later, generally our real selves, the children inside, are still innocent and shy as magnolias. Like, that's literally what being a human is, like, learning how, like, you don't naturally just come out of the womb experienced. Everyone starts out innocent and gains experience. And I get what she's saying with, like, the creation. I think she uses the particular phraseology of, like, the marble woman, of, like, Amy constructing herself out of marble in order to appear, like, beautiful to people around her. But again, like, this isn't unique to Amy. All people do this. I think
the reason it stands out, actually, though, is probably because a lot of other characters in Little Women seem kind of like archetypes.
That's true.
And, like, I think Meg seems pretty static. Yes, she learns lessons, but you kind of always know her inner core. And the same goes for Beth. And Jo has a little bit more of a character arc, I would say, and she's a little more dynamic, but she also, I feel like she always adheres to her core. But Amy is the one I see the most drastic difference in the way she is characterized between parts 1 and 2. And I think you're absolutely right that in real human life, that's like the way that humans are. But in the context of the book, that's why it stands out to me, and that's why I think that Amy has always been a mystery to me.
Nice. I guess that might feed into why I was just so affronted by Blackford's words in some areas, where she just like she basically placed Amy in this place of ambiguity between innocence and deep experience. But like in that place of ambiguity, Blackford basically was saying that Amy almost had no degree of agency, like she was just vulnerable to attacks from whoever. And I don't think that really transfers to our lives, because like even though we, like Amy, live in a place of ambiguity where we're still learning and experiencing and putting on this facade, we still have to make choices, and those choices don't appear to us to be like demonic. So I feel like she makes Amy out to be more evil and or more naive than she should.
Yeah, it's like she can't really decide what she wants to posit about Amy. But I do want to give Blackford some credit. I do kind of buy that she sculpts her own image consciously, because that's something she like super values. Like that's one of her core values, I would say, is that like she wants to please the social sphere. And I don't think we should fault her for that necessarily, because like a lot, like you were saying, a lot of people do this. A lot of women are kind of forced to do this and like look at ourselves through the male gaze, as Margaret Atwood talks about. Yes. And so my huge takeaway from this piece is that, yes, I agree with some things in Blackford's writing. I disagree with some things in Blackford's writing, but I do think that the character of Amy has honed the craft of making herself into what she wants to be through society's eyes, which is why her true, quote-unquote, personality / characterization seems hard to pin down for a reader like me.
Yeah.
Yes. What are your takeaways?
Like changing herself to even perceive the audience's eyes in a way.
Yes.
My takeaway, I definitely think I hadn't ever thought about like Amy changing herself as a work of art, like a living work of art. So I thought that was so interesting, especially to view under the lens of what it means to be a true artist. And I think bringing it back to what we were talking about earlier, like why the rivalry between her and Jo is so poignant, is because you see direct clash in this way. Jo is an artist who cares more about the process and doesn't care about like making herself a living work of art, whereas that's Amy's main goal, while the process falls away. You see direct clashes of what it means to be an artist, and I think the problem with me in Blackford's writing is the fact that she seems to elevate the Jo's way of being an artist. But like,
yeah, she even has a quote that I don't think I'll be able to find it right now, but she says, which form of art wins?
Yeah.
Like, she thinks that one wins, maybe to Alcott, maybe to herself. We're not really sure in the way that she writes it, but yes.
So, I think it's so interesting, and I think since Jo is seen as the protagonist of Little Women, that's the idea many people leave with, is that when you place these ways of art in direct contrast, one has to win, leading to Jo being elevated and Amy being downtrodden, as we see in society's reception of her in the past.
That's a very good point, Sarah, and I think that's a great place to end on. So thank you, everyone, for listening to our discussion of this piece and of our question, who is Amy, and especially in relation to Jo.
Holly, if you're listening, sorry.
Have a good day, everyone.